Thinking procedurally, what does that even mean? To me, it means a habit of analyzing things that you want to build, that you want to create, in order to break them down into manageable and creatable parts, which, when put together, make up the object or the artwork you want to create. And not only is it finding those individual parts into which we'll divide our artwork or our object, but also finding recipes for creating those individual parts, as working generatively or procedurally means building tiny machines, in our case tiny node trees, which we'll then link together to automatically or semi-automatically create whatever we want. After lots of searching around and thinking what we want to do today, I decided on creating a procedural cactus. And the worst thing you can do after deciding on what you want to create is just starting to work from memory, because memory can be deceptive, especially with objects that we think we know how they look and know how they are constructed. And actually the first thing I did when starting out this project was to build a cactus from memory, which did look totally unrealistic. So after a few minutes working on this, I started finally getting my senses and started Googling images of cacti. So once we are in image search, I just open up a few tabs with a bunch of interesting cacti and maybe a few close-ups that I think could help when creating our setup. And already we can see a few things in those images here. For example, that these higher ridges in the cacti here, they are not straight. Instead, they are slightly curved in a helical form. So they rather than a straight line create this kind of angled, slightly helical form. And also those ridges are not flat, but they consist out of these individual protrusions here onto which the individual spikes sit. However, when it comes to close-ups of those spikes, I had a hard time finding something that made sense. But luckily, after looking a bit around in our house, I found this beauty, a somewhat healthy, somewhat unhealthy cactus, which I used to break down this plant into its individual parts. So let's talk a bit about the individual parts of our cactus. We have this main cross-section here that forms the cactus. So if we would slice our cactus horizontally like this and turn it by 90 degrees, our cross-section would look something like a star with X amount of triangles protruding from the center. In my case, I counted those triangles on the cactus I had at hand, and there were 13 of those from which the spikes then protruded. Also, if we were to look at the cactus from the side, you could see this ridge-like structure here, which in my example looked a bit like this, with some of those ridges curving slightly upwards like this. Also, this angle here, this twist, was a bit more extreme in the cactus I had at hand. So instead of this slight twist, we are to model a stronger twisted cactus. And then finally, the main detail, I think, were those spikes. And let's look at those spikes and find out what their system is. So let's break those down individually again. Those spikes originate from a spherical or roundish structure, which forms their center. Let's look at this from the top. So it's the center. And it's quite furry, fluffy, so it has some fur on it, some micro detail here, just making this look very soft, a bit like this. And then from the center, we have a bunch of spikes protruding. In our case, it was always 6 spikes protruding outwards. So let's just draw them in. 1 spike here, 1 there, and 4 more like this. Again, looking from the top. Also, as a micro detail, these clusters on my cactus had also tiny hairish-like spikes just protruding outwards here, and just 2 of them. And they were way thinner than the normal spikes and flexing, bending. And then finally, there was 1 rather large spike protruding towards us from the center of this cluster here. So if we look at it from the side, let's again just draw this center here. Looking at this from the side, we have our 6 radial spikes protruding outwards like this, and they are slightly angled and slightly individually crooked. And then we have this main spike, which is a bit thicker, protruding outwards. And as you can see already by the diagram and the parts I focus on, we are roughly going to create 2 parts here. One, the cactus body, the green parts here, and then those spike clusters. And then we can add a few additional details here and there, for example, a bit of dust and some random particles sitting on this cactus. But for now, let's stick to those 2 main parts and start building. So in Houdini, the very first thing I want to do is drop down a geonode, which will serve as our container for the geometry that we're going to create, and dive in there. And in here, I need 2 things to create the main shape of our cactus. That is a backbone, which drives the shape and direction into which the cactus is growing, and a cross-section. Remember this star-shaped cross-section we talked about. So let's create both by dropping down a line, which we'll just use to create the most boring cactus there is, just a straight growth upwards. If we enable point display, you can see this has only 2 points, one at the start and one at the end. And for our case, we need a few intermediate points, so let's increase the point count here to say 12. And also, let's create a star, which is really easy if you have Labs tools installed, by just typing star here, and the Labs star tool will come up. Let's set the view flag on this, and we can see we are creating this giant 5-sided star. In my case, I want to decrease the radii here to 0.1 and 0.15. So I'll make this tiny star here and then increase the divisions to 11 in my case. Again, the cactus that I have here has 13 divisions. However, 11 looked good when I prepared the setup here. Also for later, I want to make sure that the spikes are only on these outer points here. So I'll immediately create a group, which I'll attach after the star. And in here, let's create a point group, which is called inner, into which we'll only put the inner points. And in this case, I decided to do that by unchecking base group and instead checking keep in bounding regions and setting this to be a bounding sphere, which I will then scale down. And what I can do here is right click into the first size slot here, go to copy parameter, then double click into the second slot and paste relative reference and do the same for the last slot as well. And now I can dial in all dimensions with just the first slider. And now I'm selecting only those inner points. Okay, immediately what I can do is drop down a sweep node and create the general outline of my cactus body by wiring in the line into the backbone and the star into the cross-section input slot. And if I highlight the sweep now, I can see I swept this star along my backbone. Not much to see yet. So let's make this a bit more cactus shaped by scrolling down here and checking apply scale along curve. And then if I dial down this curve menu here and maybe set those individual points interpolation here to be a B-spline and not linear, and then adding a few points in here, I can now start dialing in the exact shape of my cactus to maybe something like this. And next I want to give this cactus some twist. In order to twist those ridges a bit, which I can do by scrolling down here, and under partial twist just dial in the angle by which I want this twisted. In my case I stuck to 50 degrees, but those are parameters you can dial in later. Now, in order to make these ridges protrude here and there where those spiky buds sit, I will create quite a bit of a node chain. So just follow me. The first thing I want to do here is randomize the diameter of those individual cross sections here to make the cactus be a bit more organic, as almost everything in real life isn't perfect and needs some dirt or some irregularities thrown on it. I can do that by, after I created this line here, wiring in what's called an attrib randomize. Because what the sweep will implicitly do is read an attribute that is on this geometry called p-scale in order to scale up those individual cross-sections or scale them down. So that's why the attribute randomize in there, and by default it's set up to randomize the color, which I don't want. So instead of having the attribute that we randomize called CD, which is color diffuse in Houdini speak, let's call this one p-scale, like this, which is a uniform scale in Houdini. Uniform scale only needs one dimension, it's just a single float, and you can already see we are randomly scaling the diameter of our cactus here. Admittedly, we are scaling it a bit too strongly, so let's dial in our min and max values, maybe to 0.9 and 1, so we get only a tiny bit of irregularity in here. So let's bypass this node to see before and after like this. So a bit of irregularity in here. Next, I want to subdivide this backbone here, so we have twice as many points here. And then I want to take every second point and just move that outward to create those individual ridges here, those protrusions, which I'll do by first taking this line and resampling it, giving it twice as many points here, which I'll do using the resample node wired in down here. And what I need to do first here is uncheck maximum segment length and instead check maximum segments. And my line has 12 points, so down here let's increase these segments to twice that, 24. And I could always do that manually, however I would have to take care of adjusting my points and my resample segments in parallel. So instead what I want to do is use a link or an expression or relative reference that we already used when dialing in the size of our grouping region here. So I'll go into my line here, right click on the points, copy that parameter, go down to the resample node, and in here in the segments I'll just double click in here and go to paste relative references, which will paste this expression here. And now if I click out of that node, you can see it's turned green, and if I click on the name here I can see which value this transports actually. So click on it again and multiply this times 2, so we get our desired segment count here. And now this is always linked to my points up here. Alright, let's select every second point on our backbone here. Remember, it's just this backbone here. And every second point we want to scale up slightly. For that, we'll just take a group range node, group by range here, and let's press Shift and Enter to automatically attach it to the resample node. And in here, I want to set this, if I scroll down, to select every 1 out of 2 points. And if I scroll up again, this needs to be set to create a point group. And now I can see with those orange points, those are in this newly created group here called group 1. In order to scale up or down those individual points, points here. I'm going to use a attribute remap node, which again, by shift entering, I'll attach to this line here. And let's wire that into our sweep and again, set the view flag on our sweep so we can see what that does now. In here, in the attribute remap, what I want to do is take the p-scale attribute that we already wrote out in those individual segments of our backbone and scale it up or down a bit to create those impressions of those nooks and crannies protruding from here. So I'll select this to work only on the group we just created, the group 1, and then I'll select the attribute I want to influence, which is the p-scale, and it should have the same name after we drove it, and then I can just dial in the output max here to either protrude or move those parts inwards a bit, like so. And finally, for later, I want to set an attribute on those parts that protrude from this cactus here in order to be able to select them later after we did a few things to the geometry, which I can do using an attrib create. And in here, I'll just have this affect anything that is not in the group 1. So anything except group 1, which I can do with this exclamation mark here. And if I drag this down here, let's call this attribute large. So the larger cross sections in here, and set this value to 1. And everywhere else, it should be 0, like this. Okay, quite a node tree that we already did here to create this basic cactus shape. However, that's a bit too low resolution-wise for my final geo. So what I want to do is take this group, or rather this whole geometry here that forms my backbone, so that comes out of here, and again resample this using a resample node, and let's move that over here maybe, drag down the sweep node like this, and then let's wire this backbone stream into the resample node in here. And in the resample node, in this case, I want to just set the maximum segment length to something really small, so I'll highly subdivide this backbone here. And also if I scroll down here, I want to activate the curve view attribute. The curve view attribute is an attribute generated automatically by this node, starting at 0 at the first point and going through 1 at the last point here. Let's just uncheck the point display. And the reason I wanted to create this curve view attribute is now I can use a color node and set this to ramp from an attribute and then select the curve view attribute in here. And now I can colorize those individual points and use those to give my cactus its color. So again, maybe starting out from a brownish color like, I don't know, this, going to some yellowish color, and then finally going to a light, maybe olive green, and finally arriving at a very lush, almost bluish green, maybe something like this. And let's just adjust those maybe a tiny bit, like so. Okay, let's use a second sweep. I'll just copy and paste this one here, and now I'll wire in this backbone into my sweep here, and I can now see I've got a much more detailed cactus, also with color on it. And if those protrusions here are now too spiky for my liking, what I can do in the resample node is switch this interpolation mode from straight edge to interpolating curves. So now I've got this smoothly undulating shape here. However, if I look at this from the top, I can see my star cross section is a bit too geometric, too sharp for my liking. So again, what I'll do is take this star here, the star group, and wire it into a resample node. Don't need the inner group now. Let's just highlight this here. And the resample node in this case is set up to be 2 cores. So let's uncheck the maximum segment length and check the maximum segments instead and increase those quite drastically. So now if I highlight the point display, I can see I've got many points here instead of just the edge points before. I'm doing that so I can now use a blur node, which is called attrib blur, and make sure I'll uncheck pin border points in here, and then increase the blurring iterations to smooth out this star shape like this. And then finally wire that into my sweep node here. So now if I uncheck the point display, I can see I've got a much more organic looking base shape for my cactus. Okay, let's clean this up, or try cleaning this up a bit. Maybe move this over here and this over here. So now I've got my high-res cactus here, the body with the color, and this low-res cage geometry here. One more thing I want to do with my high-res geo is again add a bit of organic variation into it by using what's called a mountain node, which is just a attribute noise saw set up to work on the position of those individual points here, which in this case is set up a bit too extreme. So let's decrease the amplitude to say 0.005. So let's check and uncheck this node, just a bit of variation in here. And maybe let's also dial back the element size to make this noise a bit more fine-grained. So again, after and before here, we just add a bit of variation. Finally, for rendering, let's give this normals using a normal node, just set up to its default values. Okay, that's the cactus body. Let's use this cage here, which I only created to have positions for my spike clusters to position those spike clusters, which I'll first have to create, of course. So again, my spike clusters are formed from these 6 radial spikes, 1 central spike, and a fluffy, furry center. So let's move over here and start creating those. Let's start simple and just create my radial spikes by first creating a cone, which is done, of course, with the tube node here. I can create a cone by just taking this tube here and scaling down its first radius to 0, so it's really pointy. And this is a bit too large for my liking, so let's dial down the second radius to something really small as well, that is 0.03, like this. And then also let's dial back the height to 0.1. And again, if I zoom in here, my radius is too large, so what I can do is either dial back my radii in here or just use the radius scale, which influences both radii. So I end up with this really sharp spike here. Now if I zoom in, this only has two cross sections, one at the start, one at the end. And as I want to shape this spike a bit more organically later, I want to add a few more rows, that is a few more cross sections. In our case, let's maybe go with 16. Now for rendering, let's give this a nice color gradient using the attribute adjust color node in here, and I want to adjust the color based on an attribute I want to remap. So I'll just set the pattern type to remap attribute in here and scroll down a bit, as the attribute I want to remap in here is not called mask, but I want to base this up on our position, so nothing happening now. But as soon as I hit compute range, I can now see I'm getting these gradients here. Also, I want to move the center of my tube up a bit and rotate it around a bit. So I'm rotating it by 30 degrees like this, so it points out of our cluster a tiny bit, and then move it up 0.05 units and forward 0.03 units like this. And then again, in our attribute adjust color, I'll have to click on the compute range again. So now I'm getting this range of my colors, and now I can use this gradient here. Let's maybe, I don't know, go only for 3 colors or maybe only 2 colors. And let's set this to a reddish skin tone, maybe like this, and this one to a very, very pale yellow, maybe something like this. Okay, this will be my spikes for my radial spikes, which I can create using a copy node, copy and transform that is, which I'll attach down here. And here I want 6 spikes, which I will rotate along the z-axis, that this axis here, by 60 degrees. So now I've got this cluster here out of 6 spikes. If I want to make this a bit more procedural, I can take my total number of spikes, copy that parameter, paste it down here in the z rotation as a relative reference, and then use this to divide 360 degrees by it. So now if I click on rotate, nothing changed here in the values, but if I decrease or increase the total number here of spikes, they will always be rotated by the right amount here. Again, let's reset those to 6. Also, let's create another tube here for the central spike here, and maybe use a merge node to merge all this geometry we will be creating here into a single geostream so we can see something. Again, my tube here is quite too big, so let's scale this down here, giving this a radius of, let's start with 0 at the first end, 0.065, the second radius. Again, let's decrease the radius scale to 0.1 and also decrease the height to 0.08 and have this protrude along the z-axis here and move it out a bit, 0.04 units, like so. When looking at the spikes in my cactus here, one thing I noticed is that this frontal spike here was a bit blunt. So let's try increasing this radius a tiny bit like so it gives this a bit of bluntness. And also I want to increase the rows again so I can bend this a bit, make it look more organic later. Also in here, let's just copy the attribute adjust color here to colorize this a bit and make sure we hit compute range to adjust this to the position of this tube here, and maybe add a third knot in here, which I'll give a brownish, dark, maybe a slightly pinkish, slightly aubergine color like so, making this a tiny bit darker, and also the second node here, maybe saturating it a bit more to bring out the central spike a bit more. All right, finally, let's create this fur ball in here that ties everything together. And for that, I want to just take a bunch of tiny lines, which maybe are a bit crumpled, and copy them on a tiny sphere. So let's create both our sphere and these lines. And maybe let's just take this whole bunch of nodes, which will form the central cluster, move it over here so we've got a bit more space. So let's start by creating those individual lines, which will form a single strand of hair or fur by again using our line node, which will drop down here. Let's highlight this. And by default, it's quite too long. So let's scale it down to 0.03 units like so. Again, let's highlight our individual points, and we need a few more points here. Let's go for 16 in order to be able to crumple this up. And also I want this to point not only in Y direction, so let's put this to 0, but in Z direction like so, because everything we're going to copy on the tiny sphere that we'll use as a ball shape for this will be oriented along its Z axis. For now, let's just uncheck the point display and give this line colors by using the color node. Goes in down here, and let's just select a slightly yellow, orange, very desaturated color. Yeah, maybe something like this. Next, let's copy those individual lines onto a sphere. For that, we need a sphere first. So let's create a sphere, which I'll set up to have a rather small radius, 0.01. And let's set the view flag on here. So a tiny sphere. And I want this to be not a polygonal mesh, but a polygon, creating those those triangular shapes here. By increasing the frequency, I can increase the point count of this sphere here in order to make our fur sparse or dense. In this case, with more points, it'll be denser. Now I only want this sphere to point towards the direction of my point cluster, so I will truncate it using a clip node, which I'll attach below it, and make sure we are clipping not in the X, but in the Z direction like this. And then I can influence my distance here by middle mouse clicking and holding this, which will give me this value ladder, and then I can select the steps which I want to increase or decrease this value by. So I'll just go to minus 0.02 units here, just clipping it like this. Again, let's create normals, in this case not for shading, but for orienting my individual fur hairs towards the normals. So just a standard normal node, which I'll set to create the normals not on vertices, but on points. So if I hit the normal display now, I can see those normals just pointing outwards from our sphere. Again, let's use an attribute randomize to randomize the scale, the P scale, so my hairs will have different length. Again, not randomizing the color, but the P scale, which has just one single dimension. And in my case, I want to randomize this between 0.3 and 0.5, making sure we will scale those individual hairs coming in here between a third of its original size and half of its original size. And again, those were just values that I find out by trial and error when setting up the setup. All right, we are finally ready to use a copy to points to take these individual lines and copy them onto those points coming in here. So let's wire this in here and highlight that. And now we can see we have this star bursty shaped bunch of hairs, which of course is a bit too regular. So in order to break it up, make it a bit more organic, crumply, let's attach a mountain again to this output here, which is just a noise on the position of those individual points. And similarly to what we've done previously, I want to decrease the amplitude to be very small to 0.003. But also if I dial this down here, I want to decrease my element size quite drastically, which is the scale of the underlying noise, to 0.007, like so. And now I get this crumpled look of my furry hairs here, like so. Lastly, for later, for rendering, I want to do two things. First, I want to group all these individual strands into a group called hair. So let's use a group node, call this group hair, and make sure everything, which I'll select with an asterisk, is in this group here. And finally, for rendering, I need to create a width attribute telling Houdini's render engines how wide those individual hairs should be. So I'll attach an attribute create, call the attribute I want to create width, scroll down here, and set its value to 0.0005. So really small. Again, trial and error when preparing this. All right, this subtree here, let's move that over here and merge it with our spikes. So that goes in here too. And maybe, just maybe, we want to cover up this central section by just taking this sphere here, copying and pasting it, and also making sure it has the same color as my hair. So taking this color node here, copying and pasting it over here, wiring in the sphere, and then also merging this with the rest of my geometry like this. And maybe let's just scale up this sphere a tiny bit like so. So it covers up those spikes here, or maybe even a bit larger. Yeah, that should work. And also this sphere doesn't need as many polygons, so I can dial back the frequency here to make this a bit more lightweight. All right, that is one of my spike clusters. So now I want to take these individual clusters and copy them onto the points on this low-res mesh of my cactus here, and only copy them on those points protruding here, like those. And for that, I have to do a few grouping operations to select those points here. But before grouping this, I want to add normals to this. Again, normals make sure I can align my individual clusters, which I'll copy on them here, so that they point outwards. So let's add a normal node after my sweep here. Set this to generate point normals. Messes up the shading, but let's not get irritated by that, because in the end what we'll render is this high-res geometry over here, and we'll use this low-res geometry only to place the spike clusters. Remember this large attribute that we set here, and we can visualize that by clicking on this info icon here and then clicking on this large attribute here. So now we are getting this viewport visualizer, which goes from blue where it's 0 through gray where it's 0.5 to red where it's 1. We want to use this large attribute to be able to select those cross sections that are pointing outwards here, which I can do using a group expression. And in here, let's call this group buds, and it should be a point group. And in here, I want to select everything where the large attribute is, say, bigger than 0.5. I can do that by accessing this attribute using a shorthand. So I'll type the @ symbol and then the name of the attribute, large, and want to check if it's larger than 0.5, like so. And now you can see I only selected those large rings here. However, now I'm also selecting those parts that are on the inside here, which I don't want. And I can get rid of them or move them out of the group by using a group combine, which is used to combine several groups. And as I only have 2 groups in here, so if I middle mouse on this here, actually I have 3 groups here, buds group 1 and inner, I can use this logic in here to take my buds group, which should be equal to the bud group that is already in existence, but from it subtract the group 1. So now I only have the outermost points selected here. And finally, again, before we copy those individual clusters on those points, let's randomize their scale using again an attrib randomize, and you know the game by now. In here, I want to randomize p-scale, and in this case, I found values ranging between 0.6 and 0.7 fitting. Let's use a copy to points to take all this and copy it onto those points coming out here. So copy to points goes in between those, my clusters go in the first, and my template points go in the second slot in here. And before setting the view flag on this, I want to make sure that in here, as target points, I only select my buds group. Then let's cross our fingers, select this, and we can see that those clusters are now get copied onto those points. However, they still look a bit too regular because they're always oriented exactly away from the cactus's body. So let's change that by using another attrib randomize in our template point stream here, why that's in after the randomize that randomized the p-scale. And in here, we want to randomize our normal direction, which we can do by just entering n here. And now this looks a bit too random. So down here in the noise distribution, let's set this to create a direction or orientation, and also check cone angle. And under the direction, let's take our previously existing normal as its default direction here. And then we can use this cone angle here to dial in how much randomness we want compared to what we had previously. And also let's set this operation to add this value to our normal and not set it directly. Something like this, something around 70 worked well for me. Again, as always, to break this up and make it even more organic, another mountain node is helpful. Of course, by default, it's set up too drastically, so let's scale it down again. Set the amplitude to 0.007 and the element size to 0.1. And up here, let's uncheck noise along vector, which of course reset my amplitude settings. So again, 0.007 like this. And luckily it didn't influence the element size. So what that did is, if we zoom in here a bit and bypass this node and just flick it, we can see it just distorted the whole thing a tiny bit. So now it's finally time to merge this cluster of spikes here with my high-res geometry, which is this here. And let's just disable the viewport visualizer so we can see its original color here. So maybe let's just drag this down here and then use another merge node to merge both our clusters and our high-res geometry. Let's have a look at this. And the only remaining problem is that some of those clusters are a bit outside of the cactus geometry here. So up here, what I can do is take this sweep node and let's scroll up here, scale this cross section to say 1.1, making this cactus extrude a bit further outwards. Again, if I want to have this fully procedural, what I need to do is link those two sweep nodes here so that they are driven with the same values or almost the same values, except this scale cross section here. So what I'll do is go to the first sweep node, which I'll use to drive this whole thing. And for all the parameters that I want linked, right click on them, go to copy parameter, then go over to the sweep node that I want to drive by it and right click on here and paste relative reference. And in this case, it's the only thing where I have to manually add something, multiplying this by 1.1 to again scale this up a tiny bit. I'm going to do the same thing on the first sweep node for the scale here. So right click on the scale ramp, copy parameter, go over to the second sweep here, right click on scale ramp, paste relative reference. Now let's scroll down here and do the same thing for the rotation. So on the first sweep node, let's just copy the partial twists here, right click, copy parameter, go to the second sweep, right click on the partial twist here and paste relative reference. So now those two values should be linked together. And if I dial in on the first node, the second high-res node should follow, and it does. Perfect. So what's the advantage of going through this whole hassle here? Well, by easily adjusting some of your parameters, for example, the cross-section of this cactus here, or its overall scale, or the number of divisions on your star, you can create a plethora of different cacti. And instead of manually modeling them, you can just shell out a really large library of cacti or plants or whatever you want, without really having to worry about manually building them. So that's the advantage of this. It takes away lots of labor and lots of time that you'd have with individually creating all those assets. However, it shifts your project schedule, so it takes time to build this machine, this procedural setup that generates those cacti. So be sure to manage expectations, not only towards your client, but also towards your producer, art director, and creative director. These setups take a bit of time to develop upfront, but once they are working and once they are built, they make massive asset creation a breeze. What we could do now is, similarly to how we created these first centers of our spike clusters here, add a bit of overall dust to our cactus here by just scattering additional individual hairs onto my whole geometry here, and maybe procedurally model a planting pot, and then either export to a game engine or take this into Solaris for rendering using Karma. All this is set up in the scene file that I will provide, and I urge you to explore it. However, as this is meant as an intro to how procedural modeling and procedural thinking works, I want to leave it at that now. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate contacting us. And also, we are always very intrigued to see which kind of artwork you produce using this technique. And finally, as always, until next time, it is cheers and goodbye.